So the picture that I was kind of imagining, I don't really have time nor energy to really go into a very detailed version of like some of this the polarized tendency that also like kind of brings people into still being controlled by the same similar mechanisms that they think they're fighting. There's a lot of complexities that go into it, but the picture I was starting to formulate in my mind was kind of like, so if you imagine, okay, I'm just kind of chilling here. So it's like, we'll see if I could do a straight line. Anyway, so imagine like this line. Maybe there's kind of like the middle area. You have like these like polarized sections here, right? And let's just say like, so some of this like represents the polarization. Let's just say there's kind of like this polarized stance here and here. I'm like attempting to clarify. We'll see if this works or not. And let's just say like this area, these polarized areas tend to assume that like they're different from each other, but they're both basically vying for maybe if we make it a circle, like this circle represents the system, like the dominant present system. There could be alternative ways of creating a system, but it refuses, so it kind of maintains this dominance. And so they're opposing each other, but they're actually like seeking for this similar domain of dominance. Like, whoops, I'm trying to draw while I'm on the side here. So let's just say it like encapsulates this whole parameters of like the dominance of the whole structure, the whole system. And so even though we look at it as like, oh, they're so far from each other, they're like opposing each other, you could see how it actually lines up with vying for the dominance of the whole system. And so what you find is like now you're finding the establishment parties seem to be opposing each other, but then you find like their common thread is like they both are aligning with like Israel, right? So like, and we're not talking, so they keep making these claims that they stand with like Israel and the maintenance of like the system. And so they keep having to utilize this tricky language where they seem different from each other, but this group like creates this like package deal, right? So it creates this package deal to appeal to society, but it will only deliver that if they connect to their mode of like vying for systemic dominance. And then this party also proposes its package deal, same thing, but it has to like go along with their mechanism for their vying for jockeying for systemic dominance. But then you find when it really comes to it, you find like, well, how come this party, the establishment, and this establishment still utilize this sense where they're like vying for a position to dominate Israel and what they think Israel and their ideology represents on the world stage, right? And so then it even gets even more tricky because you're talking about militant, dominant Israel. You're not talking about the spirit of Israel. And so then it kind of goes into like all this interpretation of, well, what does it really mean to be like in the spirit of Israel? So anyway, so we'll just talk about that and just say there's a different way to think about Israel that's different than the modern state of the militant form of Israel that justifies this kind of like alliance with political parties to remain relevant or whatever. Then you can get into like well, like this is a longer question though, like why would people want to like align themselves with Israel as though they think that has to be the maintenance of like the dominant world power and dominant world system. And it does go into a lot of ideology and stuff like that. And I just happen to think it's incorrect. And they do a lot of maneuvering to like exploit and manipulate the storyline and make people, like kind of like fall in line anytime any of these like groups in within like that represent the people here, whatever side they find themselves on. Every time they try to create some kind of like group consensus or movement, even when you had people saying let's kind of have a middle ground, where we can draw from the best of these options and like create a good cohesive system. And then you would find these polarized ideologies controlling the system. They would offer these ways to like absorb it and bring it back into their control. And so ultimately they didn't really want to negotiate the better parts of these options for the people. They still wanted to like jockey for a position. So anyway, when I was saying earlier, and I was trying to say, like, let's just say, let's see, how would I simplify this argument? Do I want to offer a certain example of somebody? So let's just say, let's give examples of like, so here's these establishment, and they have these like questionable antics and processes that they use behind the scenes in this covert methodology to strategize ways to like take over this side, so that they have Israel in this sense represents dominance, like world dominance. So they're vying for this position in these alliances with Israel. Israel then usually utilizes this function of like covert methodology, infiltrating these groups, keeping the power of the people, keeping watch over, like guarding the way that any ideas would be shared in any form or another, whatever, on behalf of fighting for this side of power, whatever. So this is probably why you'd see like even the Biden administration was fighting for Israel, even the Trump administration fighting for Israel, and their investments and vying for like leveraging the ideology of these ideas and whatever. Whereas at some level they still kind of like join forces for the maintenance of the dominant system, but then they still very much fight Israel's battle for them. And so they agree to divide the world up into who's for against Israel. And what's interesting is like both of these sides divide the world up in that way for the most part, whoever Israel battles. But then you like think, well, why don't they just join forces then? Why do they pretend to, like be serving the public in these different ways? And there could be, you could suppose like, well, why is that? Why do they seem to divide the world up in terms of like fighting different worlds and nations on behalf of Israel? But then within here, they negotiate different types of what Israel will represent as, or different types of what Israel will represent as. And then they try to undercut each other and whatnot. And I think because at some level, maybe I'm supposing, and I don't know, this is where I'd have to take some more time to think about it, is because they do want to fight the battle of Israel and divide the world up within these modes, but then they want to influence the ultimate, then after they do that, building Israel in this image or building Israel in this image. Then there's other people that will say like, well, let's look into this relational dynamic and the needs of the people, and then, influence building, a better system and whatnot. But then what you find is like when people start talking as much, they start realizing like, hey, actually Israel's like dividing the world up improperly. It's not necessary. So then Israel kind of gets word and then starts like playing these games to like infiltrate the minds of the people and have these power structures behind the scenes and whatnot. And then it becomes this sense of like Israel, tends to have this ideology of how they want things to go. And they tend to be playing for, ultimately they'll change the minds and then they'll be in control of how it's built or developed or, whatever. But they still play and influence through these package deals of like political ideologies and whatnot here, or playing to like what this crowd wants or this crowd wants. But then when they start to feel like these groups are getting too cozy, they're creating this party of like reaching a consensus among each other, Israel really gets suspicious of that, because they ultimately don't really want groups here transforming the way the system functions. They want to control the people so that they are in control of how the system functions. And so you'll even start finding people in these groups like starting to question like the definition of Israel and how it functions and what's going on there. And so this militant version of Israel then, starts skewing the story, infiltrating. So then you find they use these package deals here and these package deals to pin people against each other. And so that's kind of what I was saying, is like it's disheartening to see groups that like join forces here and join forces here actually seeming to become more of a cohesive team together, and then Israel or these different sides like pin them against each other. And so one of the easy modes of leverage that like this form of approach will take against this form is that one of the weaknesses here is that this generally, in general terms, tends to be groups that have maybe some level of religious influence. Maybe they just kind of want to like build their lives in a traditional manner and, just kind of go with that. And maybe in general terms, like this group will want to step outside some of the bounds and grow this level of influence into, maybe other versions kind of a little bit outside of the box. And so doesn't necessarily have to be a terrible idea, but in general it's easy to like pin these groups against each other if you have to. And so one of the things I was trying to say earlier, and I don't know if I want to like fully unpack this idea now, or I feel like I'm not really in the mode to do that, but I'll try to give kind of a general idea. Is so this side generally, I feel like there is some truth in that, some of the ability to kind of think outside the general traditional roles, there's some legitimacy to that. But then there's also some legitimacy to like just the basic function of the, a decent level of development with the traditional roles of things. And so it doesn't have to be the ultimate battleground, but it can definitely become instigated into it. And so you'll kind of find like if, like, let's just say this side would generally, maybe associate itself with like more of the like feminine sexual freedoms type mode of things. And then this side, maybe will associate itself with like just traditional family values and stuff like that. They don't have to seem terrible, like terrible ideas. But you can start to find that there is this sense where it doesn't always continue to be packaged as like just basic reasonable areas for kind of loosening up on some ideas and roles. It ends up becoming intensified by levels of like a weaponized version, intentional exploitation, covert methodology, stuff like that. And so then you kind of get this like instigated battle, like between some of these tactics and whatnot. And you'll find there's like in some forms over here, there's this like tendency for like religiosity, or taking things too far, too extreme, or being too closed off to entertaining some of these ideas. But generally, there's a lot of people like here that are kind of basically on the same team. They can take a little bit of this and they can take a little of that. They can kind of entertain this decency in like the public square, or whatever. But then you find that, like I was saying, when people start to create too much of an ability for a consensus, these different groups vying for, power, they tend to not be able to have that. And so they start instigating these groups against each other. And so one of the things that, like, as an example that you'll find, and I was kind of referring to one of these characters where I said something along the lines of, it becomes disheartening to see somebody that, like, there was this character that kind of stepped out and he started to make associations with, like, supporting some of the groups over here and supporting some of the groups over here. And you could see at first he was, like, well intended to, like, bring them together and stuff like that. And then he started having some of these investors that would utilize some of these covert methods over here, kind of going behind the scenes, creating some of these, like, attack methods and like infiltrating some of their investments and doing some of these other things. And so then he would kind of reach back into some of these influences over here, trying to solidify his investments and whatnot, tapping into a little bit of this more extremist religiosity and like areas where these groups kind of oppose each other, right? And so then it would kind of set him up for taking on some of their talking points so that he can counterbalance these talking points. And so then, even though it's being fueled by these extremist views, it ends up being pushed into these groups right here that should have reasonable options to negotiate. And in some areas, we're starting to do that. Then end up fighting these extreme battles of opposition against each other. They get pinned against each other. And then over time, they start taking on these talking points of, like, because now, maybe this group is like supporting them and this group is investing in them and, whatnot. And instead of really going behind the scenes of, like, this group fighting this battle of the methodology that's being used behind the scenes here, they instigate this group fighting this group. And it just continues to keep these guys fighting each other, and which serves these different ones maintaining their investment behind the scene. And so for me, that's why I was kind of saying, like, it's disheartening to see these groups continually being brought into battling each other and utilizing these talking points about like, for instance, you'll see, like, the right started to say stuff like, no, we're fighting your battles of the LGBTQ plus and da-da-da-da-da. Or, like, gender roles and some of these ideologies and whatnot. And it's like, I was hoping to see these people differentiate between the extreme. So let's just say right here where this group behind the scenes instigates them into these questionable antics. And so they kind of overlap. And so, like, this is where they overlap, where they buy into instigating their views. And this part, like, represents where they actually do take on an extreme form of merging these views into an extreme form, like going too far. And that could be where they were going too far with some of, like, the, like gender affirming surgery and, like, just going way too far with everybody, like challenging them, pinning these groups against each other. This group would go too far where they were like, absolutely no. This part would be where this extremism connects to this package deal, and they connect to, in some ways, they don't even really care about these political deals. They just want ultimate power, but they have to wield the public. And so let's just say this is where they merge into investing and stimulating these extremist talking points. And this could be the group that you can imagine, like, right here, they represent where they're not really spiritual, or it's not really a spiritual religious argument. They're utilizing a lot of bully tactics right here, and they politicize it. And then this group is using, right, this is where they merge with their like extremism and the package deal right here. And so this is where it's like represents their bully package, extremist versions. Like this is like absolutely no budging on gender roles. And then this is just like, not only will we not, like, we're going to turn everybody, we're going to like put everybody through the most extreme versions of like surgery and all of this stuff and whatever. It's like not really necessary, because like right here you'd find people like kind of, you know, negotiating and like, yeah, we can budge on some of these gender roles. Like I feel like it's better for us to kind of like entertain, you know, some nuance and like, you know, loosening up on those like rigid gender religiosity gender roles, you know, whatever. And they're like, sure, let's do that, you know, whatever. And they're like, yeah, that's all we really needed, so we don't really need to put on these extreme versions of like forcing ourselves into these, you know, like extreme places of like trying to justify our argument and being like drawn into being instigated by these groups, you know, or whatever, that are using all this exploitative sexualized tactics to leverage and create investments. And then we're also not trying to get in and like, yeah, we don't really want to be into these like restrictive religiosity, like hateful groups over here either. And so people really were finding this consensus, you know, to some degree. But then these extreme versions of stuff would be like, you know, they'd take it on this like, no, we're doing this and we're fighting for Israel. Like, no, we're doing this and we're fighting for Israel, you know, like basically systemic dominance or whatever. And so then these groups like keep attacking each other and saying like, no, like, so like this group would be like, no, we're not going to budge on anything you guys say, and like attacking the wrong group, because they should be probably attacking this group. But, you know, it becomes too close to like, they're like, I don't know, it seems like when I attack them, I'm attacking Israel. So I'm going to take the cheap shot. I'm going to attack these guys. And it's like, they're like, no, we will not budge on anything, you know, whatever. And so they keep intensifying the wrong argument. And then this group is like, no, we will not budge on anything, like these extremists go back and forth, right? Whereas most of these groups, and this is kind of where I was just like, you don't need to be extreme. You can offer some levels of leniency, but you refuse to offer levels of leniency here on, you know, like levels of acceptance and not utilizing bully tactics. But you're so instigated by these groups that you're using, like these groups are causing you to attack the wrong things and attack the wrong options. And then you have over here, you know, some similarities where it's like these groups could find some good consensus with these groups, and, you know, like a decency and developing and continuing in the family, and then they're being lenient with them and like people being able to somewhat get along. But they just refuse. They're just like, no, absolutely not, nothing whatsoever, you know, whatever. And it's like, that doesn't really make sense, because most people are willing, like the everyday people are willing to negotiate somewhere within here. So then you just hear people. So I was saying, like, it's disheartening to see people that were starting to try to fight the fight of helping alleviate these extremists and these extremists, then getting caught up in like, because right here, anytime anyone tries to actually be a change agent, these groups, like these extremists, like dominant system investment groups that are tied with Israel and different ones, kind of chime in and start messing with like your investments and public perception and these covert methods of like threatening you and stuff like that. And at some level you could say it's probably because there's this like addiction to like these levels of dominance, because you'll even find like Sam Harris and them start fighting for like, no, we have to maintain the dominance of the system, and it's because we're smarter, it's because we're better. And then this group is like, okay, that's correct, we are smarter and we are better, you know, which, so there's areas where they agree, right? And they start like sharing each other's like tactics on like, this is why we're better, this is why we have to destroy the rest of the world, this is why we have to, you know, do this and that, you know, whatever. And we also have to shut up the public in how they're trying to actually create peaceful modes of coexistence with other people and negotiate. We have to like shut them down, and then we have to like, create all this division among other groups. So you just find like they just don't know how to like think differently about this, which actually this is a distortion. This form of like thinking of Israel in these modes. It's very atheistic too, because all the atheists over here, whatever, like kind of bring those talking points, and these people over here buy the same atheistic talking points, of superiority and the dominance of the system, but they just try to put a religious flavor on it. But ultimately this group is just like, nah, like once we dominate you, then we're gonna like get rid of any religious influence anyway, and it'll just be a secular version of the dominant systems of the world, like utilizing these tactics to like flex our like power over other nations and whatnot. But then you start finding, wait, hey, actually, this is a distortion. It's groups within here that actually practice more of the spirit of what Israel is even about. And they do it in shared community with other groups. And they have, like actual spiritual influence. And so these guys start getting paranoid. So then they have to like infiltrate the public, and then they have to like switch around their like opinions and ideas and prevent them from being able to have any say so. And so you just find that these groups continue to do that. They kind of use like intelligence groups or covert methodology. They start enhancing, different types of weaponized investment and propaganda and all this kind of stuff. I mean, you know how it goes. So I guess for me, like what I was trying to get to was like, it's frustrating. There's a lot of scribbling here. It's frustrating to see groups that should be able to negotiate some proper levels of like public consensus and not fighting the wrong battle, not allowing these extreme political opinions that are backed by these establishment alliances and systemic dominance forms that also like police improper skewed foreign policy around the world because of the network of investment. It's disheartening to see these people have the say in shutting down conversations when they've become so hijacked and like usurped by their own extremism that they don't even know how to have proper negotiations for the everyday people. And then they start feeling paranoid about the everyday people, so they have to like skew the communication methods. They have to like shut down conversation. And then they start lying and scheming about all their different rhetoric and stories about, no, we're right. Like everybody, all the other foreign nations are, like enemies to us, and we have to double down on our influence here, and we can't budge on like our dominance, and we have to like switch this and like perpetually battle all the other nations and whatnot. And so I'm just kind of saying like say these groups that they really need to kind of like check themselves so that they're not like cause like allowing these people that are extremists that actually don't really seem to give a fuck about the everyday people, because you see these people actually work with these people behind the scenes to like fuck with everybody. And like these people work with these people behind the scenes to like fuck with everybody too. So there's a lot of fuckery going on here, like in the systemic dominance and the extremist policies that they're just utilizing to try to manipulate these people so that they could take down these people. Like they use them as kind of body shields to take down those people. These people kind of use this as like body shields to take down those people, because they just don't really care too much about the public. Like they'll sell out at any moment because they're just too extreme. And like at some point they become leveraged by investments, and like they get a talking to if they go step out of line, so they have to like keep controlling the public. So basically like these people should still keep having conversation, not let them tear them apart and say they're on separate teams or pin them against each other, because most of the people doing this work are mostly on the same team, working to transition and transform and create a livable society. They can negotiate with groups on like being flexible on gender roles and whatnot, because in reality most of these people that are cool over here already do that anyway. Most of these things are not like the worst of the worst. They get packaged by extremists, and so like these groups have to differentiate between the extremists that these guys are provoking and the actual everyday proposals and requests that these everyday people have. And then these people are going to have to do that on this side too. Like try to differentiate between this extremist like provoking and realize these everyday people have some decency of things that they would like to just be able to like share in living this shared cooperative life, you know, of a level of just public decency. And it's disheartening for me to see like these extremists packaging this to like shut down like people growing in this consensus of this shared space and shared living. Anyway, I think I got my point across. This is looking crazy. This looks like, doesn't this look like a cartoon, like some kind of like cartoon character? Anyway, I'm gonna leave it at that for now.